You know when you hear a story
Yeah.
and it just makes you stop and say, wait, what?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of how I felt reading about this guy living in Maryland, ends up deported to a high-security prison in El Salvador.
Wow.
And the U.S. government actually admitted it was a mistake.
They admitted it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It kicked off this whole international, back and forth. And that's exactly the kind of head-scratcher we're going to unpack today.
Okay.
We're diving deep into the case of Kilmar Abrego García, how this happened, what everyone's saying, the whole deal. We've got this CBS News article as our main guide here.
Yeah, and what's so fascinating, or maybe troubling, is how what should be a straightforward process, deportation, just went completely sideways.
Right.
And it reveals this tangled mess of, well, laws, diplomatic stuff, politics.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to try and trace Mr. Abrego Garcia's deportation and understand the different angles, President Bukele, President Trump, Attorney General Bondi, all based on the CBS report.
Right. So picture it. Kilmar Abrego García, living his life, family in Maryland. Then, boom, he's shipped off to El Salvador. Lands in a maximum security prison.
Just like that.
The key players are him, obviously President Bukele of El Salvador, then President Trump here in the U.S., and his Attorney General at the time, Pam Bondi.
Got it.
It really makes you wonder, how does someone go from, a normal life here to a prison cell over there because of an administrative error? That's the core question, isn't it?
It really is. What happens when a mistake like that creates these huge ripples, diplomatically, legally?
Yeah.
And it starts with that fundamental question. How does a government, the U.S. government, call its own deportation an administrative error?
Right. What does that even mean in practice?
Well, the CBS News article is quite clear. The Trump administration itself acknowledged it. They said deporting Mr. Abrego Garcia to that specific high-security prison in El Salvador, that was a mistake, their mistake.
And then you add this layer. His lawyers are adamant. They say he has absolutely zero connection to MS-13, the gang. And no criminal charges, no convictions, not in the U.S., not in El Salvador.
Which just makes the error seem even more, well, egregious.
Exactly. It highlights the gravity, right?
Absolutely. If you kind of zoom out a bit, this whole thing really puts a spotlight on the human cost when these big government processes, especially immigration and law enforcement, when they're not incredibly precise.
Yeah, the stakes are so high.
Right. Here you have an admitted error, and a man is stuck in a foreign prison, basically accused of being a terrorist, despite everything his lawyers say and what the U.S. government itself admitted. Makes you think about the safeguards, doesn't it?
It really does. So, okay, let's shift to El Salvador's President Bukele. What was his reaction?
Well, he was pretty direct. When he was actually in the Oval Office with President Trump and AG Bondi, he made it very clear he wasn't sending Abrego Garcia back.
What did he say exactly?
His quote was, how can I return him to the United States? I smuggle him into the United States, or what do I do?
Wow.
Yeah, and then, of course, I'm not going to do it. The question is preposterous.
Preposterous.
Yeah.
So he really felt the request itself was just out of line.
It definitely comes across that way. Strong sense of national sovereignty, maybe a bit of, political showmanship, too.
And what's really striking is that he immediately called Abrego Garcia a terrorist.
Yeah, that description is such a stark contrast, isn't it? The U.S. says, oops, administrative error. His lawyers say no criminal ties. And Bukele says, terrorists.
That contradiction is huge. It's like central to the whole problem.
It really is. You have to keep that discrepancy in mind as we try to figure this out.
And then Bukele also said, I don't have the power to return him to the United States. What do you make of that? Is it just about willingness, or is there a legal point there?
Well, it probably speaks to the legal and practical complexities from El Salvador's side. I mean, sure, a country controls who it detains within its borders. That's basic sovereignty.
Right.
But actually sending someone back to the country that deported them by mistake, that might not be as simple as just booking a flight. There could be legal procedures, logistical hurdles within El Salvador's own system.
Okay, so that's Bukele's stance.
Yeah.
Then you have Attorney General Bondi.
Yeah.
What was her initial take?
Her first reaction, according to the article, was basically that it was up to El Salvador whether he comes back.
Kind of washing their hands of it a bit.
Maybe, but she also added a really important point from the U.S. perspective. She said, first and foremost, he was illegally in our country.
Okay, so even with the mistake in where he was sent.
Exactly. The underlying issue for them was his immigration status in the U.S. to begin with. It's like saying, yeah, we sent the package to the wrong address, but it shouldn't have been mailed from here in the first place. Adds another layer,
Definitely complicates the responsibility aspect. And then she brought up a Supreme Court ruling, something about a plane.
Yeah, she mentioned that if El Salvador wanted to return him, the U.S. would facilitate it, meaning provide a plane.
Okay, so like, we'll help if you decide to.
Right. But here's where the CBS article points out a really crucial detail. The Supreme Court's ruling apparently didn't include that qualifier, that if El Salvador wants to part.
No.
According to the article, the ruling actually mandated U.S. government to facilitate his release from custody in El Salvador, and it sent the case back to a lower court.
So the court said the U.S. had to take steps to get him released, regardless of El Salvador's willingness. That sounds quite different from how Bondi framed it.
It really does. It suggests maybe a disconnect between her public comments and the actual legal requirement from the court. The court seemed focused on fixing the mistake, requiring the U.S. to act to get him out of that prison.
Okay, so the U.S. admitted the mistake. The Supreme Court told them to facilitate his release.
Yeah.
What did the U.S. government actually do then?
Well, the article mentions the Justice Department filed court documents. They stated they were willing to take all available steps to remove any domestic obstacles to help him return.
Remove any domestic obstacles. What does that imply? Like legal hurdles within the U.S.?
That's how it sounds. It suggests they were ready to clear any procedural or legal issues on the U.S. side that might prevent him from coming back should his release from El Salvador be secured. It shows an effort, at least on paper, to comply with the court.
Right. And then there's a State Department official, Michael Kozak.
Yes, a senior official. He confirmed Abrego Garcia was alive. He was secure in that terrorism confinement center in El Salvador.
Okay, that's something.
But crucially, Kozak also emphasized that Abrego Garcia was being held under El Salvador's sovereign authority.
Oh, so that reinforces Bukele's point, basically.
Exactly. It really underlines the limits of U.S. power here. They admit fault, the court tells them to act, but once he's in El Salvador's custody, El Salvador calls the shots within its borders. The U.S. can't just demand him back.
It's that clash of sovereignty again.
Precisely. International law, national authority, it gets complicated fast.
And the article adds some important context too, right? About the deportation flights themselves?
Yes, that's key. It mentions these flights were part of a Trump administration initiative targeting people described as members of gangs like Tren de Aragua and MS-13.
Okay.
And Abrego Garcia was deported on one of those flights. So it suggests this administrative error happened within this larger targeted operation.
Which could imply?
What?
Maybe things were moving fast. Maybe identification wasn't perfect.
It could imply that. In large-scale enforcement actions focused on specific groups, the risk of error, of misidentification, potentially increases. The goal might be targeting dangerous individuals, but the fact that someone like Abrego Garcia, who his lawyers insist has no gang ties, got caught up, it shows the danger.
Right.
The need for careful due process.
Definitely. Now, things got even stranger, didn't they, when President Trump started talking about sending U.S. citizens to prisons in El Salvador?
Yeah, that was quite a turn. He mentioned being open to it for U.S. citizens convicted of violent crimes, said his administration, including Pam Bondi, was studying the laws to see if it was possible.
And the reason? Cost savings.
That was the rationale mentioned, yeah. Potential cost savings by housing them abroad.
Well, it's a highly unconventional idea.
To say the least. Raises huge legal questions, surely.
Absolutely. Serious legal and ethical questions about incarcerating your own citizens in another country's prisons.
Yeah.
The fact they were actively looking into the legality suggests it wasn't just an off-the-cuff remark.
And did he connect this idea back to the Abrego Garcia case at all?
He made a distinction. He talked about homegrown criminals versus the situation with Abrego Garcia and others deported on those flights, whom he referred to as violent alien enemies.
Violent alien enemies, even though they admitted an error in Abrego Garcia's case specifically.
Right. That framing seems like an attempt to sort of justify the overall deportation push, even while acknowledging the mistake in his individual case. It labels the group broadly, which again clashes with the info from Abrego Garcia's lawyers.
It seems quite contradictory.
It does raise questions about how individuals were being categorized versus the specific facts of their cases. And the article mentioned legal scholars had concerns about this whole idea of sending U.S. citizens abroad for prison.
Yes, big concerns about constitutionality. They pointed to a Supreme Court case from way back, 1936, Valentine v. United States.
What did that case say?
Basically, it established that the president can't just extradite a U.S. citizen. It requires an act of Congress. There needs to be legislative authority.
So that seems like a major legal roadblock for Trump's idea.
It certainly presents a significant hurdle. Applying that precedent to sending citizens to foreign prisons That would likely face immense legal challenges based on constitutional grounds.
Then Trump also posted on Truth Social about this.
He posted about working with El Salvador to eradicate terrorist organizations and mentioned Bukele accepting custody of the most violent alien enemies.
So doubling down on that narrative.
Pretty much, it paints this picture of a strong U.S.-El Salvador partnership against crime and terrorism, framing those deported, including Abrego García, implicitly as part of that group, even while his specific case remained this unresolved, problematic issue.
Right. But it wasn't all conflict, was it? Bukele apparently had some positive things to say about U.S. policy.
That's right. The article notes Bukele praised the decrease in crossings at the U.S. southern border under Trump's policies.
Interesting.
And it also mentions that El Salvador itself has seen a really dramatic drop in its own crime rate under Bukele's very tough-on-crime approach.
So there was some common ground there, some mutual appreciation on security issues.
It seems so. It shows that amidst the specific disagreement over Abrego Garcia, there were other areas where the leaders saw eye to eye, particularly on border security and crime reduction. The Abrego Garcia situation might have been a specific friction point in a broader relationship that had other dynamics.
Okay, so let's try and wrap our heads around this. You've got the U.S. admitting a mistake deporting this guy to a maximum security prison.
Check.
His lawyers saying he's totally clean, no criminal ties.
Check.
But El Salvador's president says, no way I'm sending him back, calls him a terrorist, and says he doesn't even have the power to return him. Meanwhile, the U.S. says, well, we'll facilitate his return if possible. The Supreme Court says they have to facilitate his release, but they also respect El Salvador's sovereignty.
Yeah, it's a real knot, a genuine international puzzle.
It really is. These conflicting viewpoints, the fact that Mr. Abrego Garcia's situation is just unresolved, it really lays bare how complex international relations get, doesn't it?
It absolutely does, especially when individual lives get caught up in these bigger political currents and national interests. You have the U.S. owning up to a serious error.
Which is significant in itself.
It is. But then they run up against the sovereign decision of another nation, El Salvador, which seems, at least publicly via its president, unwilling to help fix it.
And it just leaves you thinking about so many things, like what are the responsibilities of governments when mistakes like this happen? Mistakes with huge consequences for people's lives.
And what are the real limits of cooperation between countries when you hit a fundamental disagreement like this one?
Yeah, and the human rights angle. What about Mr. Abrego Garcia, just stuck in this diplomatic and legal limbo?
Exactly. This whole deep dive into his case, it really pulls back the curtain on how immigration policy, diplomacy, and individual rights all intersect, sometimes really messily.
Yeah.
It forces you to think about the impact of administrative errors within these powerful government systems and just how incredibly hard it can be to undo those errors when they cross international borders.
And at the end of the day, you're left wondering about the impact on him, the individual caught in the middle, and what this all says about justice and sovereignty in our interconnected world.
A lot to think about there.